Suzy, well, thank you very much for doing this interview. I feel totally honored on my side. And I would like to thank also the Dutch Fashion Foundation, because it's, of course, their birthday. And that's the reason why they teamed us up. So,
well, happy birthday to everybody who's involved in this presentation and this discussion, because I think it's so important that we come out, especially we in the fashion world, and we speak out, and that we really try and get something out of a conversation.
well, thank you very much. Well, happy birthday, Dutch Fashion Foundation. Okay, in that particular context of this conference, which is called Fashion and I, there are 3 domains which they want us to talk about. And one of them is to start with you, Suzy. And one of the questions I would like to present to you is that, you seem to operate in a domain which, you could say almost cherishes the notion of amnesia, and you represent the notion of continuity within that idea. Do you recognize that particular role? And if so, how do you approach that particular idea of yourself?
Well, if you're saying that I'm a sort of historic person by now, because I've been around so long, that makes me very worried, because I want to be of now. I'm interested in what is happening now. Of course, I must say that when Manolo Blahnik handed me something that I had written in 1970, which he pointed out to me was 50 years ago, talking about shoes that he was doing and clothes. And I realized that this was really almost the beginning of my career, when I was chosen by Charles Winter, the father of Anna Winter, and made an editor at the London Evening Standard newspaper, where I stayed for about a long time, 4 or 5 years. So, and even then I was writing about fashion, and even then, do I dare to say it, I think I was quite good at spotting the people who would go on and have a future in the fashion world.
No, of course, I'm not referring to you as a historical figure, but somebody who carries a notion of continuity with you. But I found out in those podcasts that you could say through the changes you have embraced, for instance, now your role as an editor of Vogue International, you also had to employ different instruments. For instance, nowadays, your voice has become very important. How do you recognize that particular idea?
Well, the first thing I must say is that I've left Condé Nast, so now I'm free to do exactly what I want to do. And
okay.
I don't know about my voice being so important. There are a lot of other people who are very strong in the fashion world and very intelligent. I think fashion has probably divided up into more categories than I knew when I was much younger. There's the whole business category, which is not really my strength, although of course I'm interested, and of course I follow these things, but I don't feel that in my heart, there's not a moment when I say, how wonderful Louis Vuitton is opening its 2000 shop. I mean, that doesn't excite me nearly as much as going to the Louis Vuitton show.
How dare you, Suzy? Well, one of the things you're touching upon Louis Vuitton, one of the things, of course, is that fashion is, you could say, the industry of seduction. And I'm sure that they try to seduce you in many ways. How did you deal with all this, you could say, this pressure also from an industry which is so, well, important?
Well, if you're talking about getting free clothes, it's just never my thing. And also, I worked for such a long time for newspapers, where really magazines I think are different, but in newspapers it was never acceptable to accept gifts, and particularly working in these great and important newspapers, I think it's right that after all, I don't believe that people who write about cars in a newspaper have a free car, so why should we do it in fashion?
That's a very nice one, but I'm sure that I think that if there's one, you could say, particular quality of fashion, that they are so capable of creating seductive environments, huh? And that's maybe the whole point also of fashion. Yeah.
I think the first thing I always think about is what are all the different words and meanings that are given to the word fashion? It goes to everything. It goes to the cheapest things that are thrown together by some poor, usually woman, who absolutely has to produce something, and right up to Louis Vuitton, things made beautifully by hand. But there's this enormous arch, I would say, that goes from one to the other. And although they both can be defined as fashion, I think it's time that perhaps we thought of trying to do ways of describing what fashion is, or what it could be, and what it is when it's not so good. I think there's a lot of talk now about fabrics and what's used, and I feel that this is very good that we're talking about materials.
I'm sure, and I love it that you have such an expanded vision, you could say, on fashion, because for a long time, and if I look at, for instance, podcasts, you're constantly asked about certain shows, and so you could say that fashion is almost considered to be synonymous to a catwalk show. And as you say, there's a very diverse field around it. If you look at the current hierarchy, is it still the show, or do you think no, there's much more focus on notions of diversity, inclusion, materials? What is your own interest in that particular field at the moment?
Well, I only hope that there is an interest in diversity, and that, I mean, there is, and we all are pleased about it, and it's very important. And also the whole idea that clothes don't have to be divided into men's clothes and women's clothes. The fluidity of fashion now is really important, because it echoes a fluidity that's going on in the world, in the larger world, not of course in every country, but in many. And this is important, so that everything is changing. And that's something that I've always learned as a journalist, that things change all the time, that you can't just sit there announcing that something is happening, because it will evolve into something else.
Yeah, that's definitely true. In one of the beautiful conversations you have, for instance, with Valerie Steele, you also refer to this importance of fluidity in relationship to notions of identity and representation. And one of the subjects you also touch upon is that, of course, there's on one hand the perspective of the designer, but there's, of course, also an industry which is still organized in terms of male collections and female collections. Do you think that these type of distinctions are also under pressure at this very moment?
Things are changing, but perhaps it's harder for the people who are running a business to change than it is for us to sit here and hope that things can be radicalized or made more interesting. That in the end, when you're talking about shows, the past system has always been to show the buyers the clothes, and hopefully that they then order a lot of them and they are delivered. But that's really changing so much. Firstly, because the owners of the brands are now really trying to keep things steadily under control, and heavily under control, I would say even. And I tell you something very interesting. I, after all, have spent 50 years, as I'm told, looking at fashion shows. And I know that I have a system in my vision, so that I look at something, I look at a model coming down, and my eyes go from top to bottom, unless maybe they're pulled out of seeing a bag or something. And then I always also look at the back and watch the model as she walks out. Now, that has changed so much, because we're all of us in the fashion business now looking at films, little mini films, and some of them are very attractive and exciting and stimulating. But the fact is that the people who make them, in other words, the fashion people, are in control and in charge, and I am not. I have noticed in particular that we now see fashion shown to us. We see the face, of course, and the head, and then we go incredibly fast downwards to the handbag, where the film lingers over this handbag, and then it goes down perhaps to the hem of a skirt, if it's an interesting one, or picking out something, and then it goes down to the shoes to pick out that. And you realize afterwards, and somebody says to you, were there any interesting collars? And you think, collars? There weren't any collars. But these things sound hilarious, but they're actually meaning that as a journalist, you're less and less in control. After all, if you can't see all aspects of what's shown to you, then you can't really do your job properly. That's the honest truth.
No, it's a beautiful metaphor you're presenting of how your eye is being more and more directed in a particular way, and what is allowed to be seen and not seen.
Well, on the other hand, on the other side, I would say that it's also the role and the reason for these companies to choose to do things that way, because they are, after all, in the selling business. They're not showing these things just to show something beautiful or wonderful or fun. They're doing it because they want it to get out there. And when you look now and see how many people, mostly young, one thinks, although I can't really prove that, who watch fashion shows when they go online, it's an enormous number. And I must say, I wonder whether we'll ever go back to a single room, which is what it has been, a very large room, with people sitting in the front rows and the second and third rows. I wonder if we'll ever go back to that when we have seen that these clothes can be shown to hundreds, thousands, and soon, no doubt, millions of people.
Yes, I'm sure. Interestingly enough, I was having a conversation with somebody who teaches their students, and they also refer to the fact that, you know, certain things were seen and not seen. And for instance, they were referring to pictures from the 60s in which they only would show the front of a dress, and they had to investigate how that particular dress was constructed. And everybody forgot that at that time a zip on the back was quite normal. So, you know, the most beautiful abstractions came out of the fact that you could only see the front but not the back.
Yes, maybe it's always been so, but it's partly the speed, you know, the speed in which things are shown to us now when we're talking about on film. And it's so quick. There's no lingering at all. There's no chance to keep your eyes on an outfit from the moment it appears to the end. So there are lots of changes. And I generally think that fashion will not go back to a system that probably went on too long. It's probably good, the change.
Mm. Suzy, in the fact that there was, although you could say fashion was always a very dynamic industry, you know, the fact that there was still, it was shown for a privileged group of people, there was the journalist then as a kind of mediator, and it gave you, although a very small time, it gave you the possibility to reflect. Now, you know, it's a world of immediacy. What is the role of the journalist in that particular context?
Oh, well, that's a difficult question, isn't it?
I'm sorry.
Because you have to say, are journalists today able, particularly in this pandemic, to do their job? Because I don't know whether you are aware, because it took me quite a long time to find out that you have certain people picked out to be able to speak to the designer before the show. I'm going to repeat that, before the show.
Yes.
So you go into the show with the information of what you're supposed to be seeing. That's quite frightening, really. I mean, imagine going into an art show and you have the artist behind you. You've seen the artist, she might have talked to you 3 days earlier. And so your head is filled with what the artist thinks. It's exactly the same with fashion. So you're told this, that, and the other. And of course, there's the second side to this, which is that if you then write something a bit iffy about the designer's work, and if you show pretty clearly that you don't think it's that good or as good as the last season, you are not going to get that chance again. If you open yourself to a designer and what she or he wants to say, on one side it's very good and very interesting, because any artist, it's interesting to hear what they're thinking and where their mind is. But then, you know, if you are supposed to be a critic, you're supposed to see it, how shall I say, with your own eyes and your own thoughts.
And not purely through the intentions of the designer. Yeah. So in other words, you're saying that the system of fashion always was organized around the fact that you had to not see certain things, but, you know, had to have a conversation with people more than had to judge what was in the end the product.
I don't really know whether people sat down and thought about these things or whether they just developed in that way. You know, it's hard to know. You'd have to talk to somebody who'd really been seeing the evolution of fashion over the years. But one thing that hasn't changed, which is that although, as I was saying before, the whole world talks about fashion, whether we're talking about something cheap or something expensive or something in between. But, you know, it was not so in the past. In the past, there were only a sort of a certain bunch of women who, and it was women then rather than men, who paid a lot of money to get an outfit by a designer. Now, I mean, I need to tell anybody who's listening to this that, you know, the whole business of cheap clothes, copied clothes, all these things. And there are a lot of arguments and there are a lot of feelings you have to have about this, because in a way, if the majority of men and women cannot afford to buy the clothes they see, then what are the clothes supposed to be for? And why shouldn't there be a cheaper version, a version that's affordable and touchable by a much, much larger number of people?
I once had the opportunity to write a kind of speculative history on Dutch fashion, because you could say the world of fashion in the Netherlands is never seen synonymous to designers. However, if you look at the user, then something very interesting is coming up. And one of the main changes you could refer to is that, especially in the 60s, you know, there was the world of self-making, and then in the 70s it became the world of self-buying, and both were sold as an idea of democratization. Since you refer to the notion of you could say fast fashion and cheaper copies, what do you consider the most democratic approach of this beautiful and as you say, diverse notion of fashion?
I think it's difficult to judge because different people have different attitudes. And I also believe that maybe now we're talking about clothes that go all over the world and certainly go all over Europe. And so therefore we're not talking perhaps about strong divides between different countries. But I can remember when it was fairly obvious that when you were looking at Spanish clothes, for example, that they were very, not sexy, that's not the right word at all, but elaborated and glamorous and looking for both men and women as though they were dressed up for something. I'm not saying this is something recent. I'm not saying that this was last year, but, you know, probably... going back 30 years, something like that still, and going back much, much longer into the far history. And I would say that you'll probably immediately shout out at me, but I would say that in your country, there is a sense of less showing off the body, certainly not showing it off in a vulgar way, but not even showing it off the body in the way that you get in France, for example, where shapely clothes have so long been part of the rules, I would say, for women anyway. For both men and women, I think in your country, perhaps it's all the, don't they call the low countries, all the ones around.
Thank you.
I think, I thought it was a compliment.
Oh, okay, yes, let's embrace it.
But I always felt that there are clothes there that are very beautifully made and have a lot of texture and maybe something like the art as well, that there is a feeling in many cases that you actually want to stroke these materials. They're so interesting and so different. And so we're talking about different countries there. I'm imagining things perhaps where there are definitely different attitudes in the people who buy the clothes, make the clothes and wear the clothes. I mean, as I said before, it doesn't apply so much now because you're as likely to see the outfits being worn by somebody in the Far East, in China, as you are in their home country. But even so, what do you think? Do you think we see some spirit of the country as we do in art, in fashion?
Well, it's a beautiful question you're asking, and I've seen it. You are thinking about it quite a lot. I've seen it in several interviews coming back, that this question of fashion and nationality in a way. One of the answers you have given me is that you said, well, you know, maybe we shouldn't look at the designer, but more in the way of things are produced or medialized. You could say New York is a glamour machine. London is very powerful in terms of media. Italy is a production machine. Maybe those type of notions have become much more identifiers than a notion of psychology or nationality. What do you think?
Well, what we know so well is that it's people who break the rules who are the interesting ones. You know, it's not that we really want to follow the themes, although we might notice them and pick them up. We're really looking for somebody who is having new ideas, who's looking ahead. I mean, whether you're talking about Coco Chanel, you know, she was so untypical of the French clothes as they were at that time. So really to be ahead, you've got to be challenging what is typical to a country or its feelings or its work. At least that's how I feel it.
What is obvious, and you are referring to it in many ways, this notion of diversity, is the fact that the fashion industry is expanding. So it's not for nothing that firms like Gucci, of course, they almost become like anthropologists, looking at, all kinds of aspects of fashion, from gender to identity and so on and so on. And they base their notion of identity, you could say, much more on those explorations than on the exact design of their clothes. In fact, their clothes are much more like a collage. How do you perceive that you could say trend?
What's so interesting is that the big brands now were obviously founded in almost every case by a particular person, very often a man. And they then were kings, queens, whatever, of the brand for at least 20 years, much more likely to be 30 years. And so nothing dramatically changed. And now we've got a situation where Gucci is tremendously full of life. It's certainly tremendously full of accessories to sell. And at the same time, it's quite different from things that other people have shown. So, and this doesn't just apply to Gucci, it applies so much around. I mean, we're seeing all the time, Chanel has not changed. That's been the great difference. Although, of course, Karl Lagerfeld is no longer with us. Even so, the person who's now doing it has been in the company for 30-something years. So, but apart from that, if you look at Dior, for example, the difference that Dior, since it's been taken over by a woman with a very strong view of the rights of women, so it's difficult to define precisely what a company stands for or what the person who's working for the company stands for, because it's on a constant change.
And does it make it more interesting for you, the field of fashion, this fact that it's so subjugated under the notion of change, or do you miss a little idea of a brand identity or a continuity of a kind of, well, signature, you could say?
Now I'm going to say something terrible.
Oh, say something terrible.
I don't care so much about brand identity. Let them get on with it. Let the brands decide these things. It's not in my decision anyway. But what I am interested in constantly is the beauty of fashion, the future of fashion, what people can make of fashion today, and extraordinary original things that can be made. And also, don't let's forget the Stella McCartneys of this world, although she's really only one of them who started it. 20 years of trying to work to make a better world out of fashion. I don't think we should spend all our time worrying about the business side of it, but quite a lot of our time worrying about what we can do to make fashion a better place.
And what do you think we could do? Because you have referred to a few things already, notions of diversity, you refer to materials, the notions of durability linked to that. Are there any other subjects which you would like to refer to if you discuss the future of fashion?
Well, I think the main one at the moment, most people would agree, is a decision about whether people should go on wearing clothes that come from an animal, or whether there should be a really strong vision of a world in which such things no longer exist or are no longer used. Nothing is simple, of course. I mean, I've seen the figures of how many jobs will be lost, how many this, how many that. You can't just change the world in a day or in a year even. So, but I do think that there are many areas in which there could be much more thought. And I think I said previously, there's the subject of how people are treated in making clothes. And there I feel very strongly. I think it's shameful, and I mean that, shameful, that companies go to countries where people are so desperate for any money that they will make clothes that are sold for much more than these people are given. And what they're given is pathetic. And I think that's very wrong. And it's not something I can really step out and do anything about. But I'd like to believe that there are people who are prepared to do that, and that there would be, say, in the same way that people are now concerned about cars and changing the whole business of a car to a totally different thing. After all, if you can do it for cars, why can't you do it for clothes?
Suzy, one of the conversations I had, and let's make this the last question I'm asking you, since we are almost, have used our time. One of the things I get out of you could say the fashion and design system is that the notion of the post-human, which I find very interesting. They said, look, for 30 years, we have addressed questions of durability as a designer. They have been very tough because we've been such part of a much larger complex. But there seems to be, this question of centralizing the human figure, like for instance, fashion has done, has created the fact that we have made everything subjugated under this idea of the man. So, this notion of the post-human seems to embrace a notion of ecology and diversity much stronger, and in which you could say the human figure has become only one aspect. I was wondering if that really becomes an important ideology, how could it affect fashion, which is so organized around, you could say, a human identity? I'm sorry, I'm just speculating, since it's our last question.
No, it's a fantastic collection. It's a fantastic question and a really interesting one. And it's very hard to answer because one thing we don't know about is the future. And after all, we're seeing so much when we're seeing movies and we're reading books about people who are not people as we understand them, who are, I forget what they are androids? They are creatures who look as though they are female or male, but they are neither. They are something that comes out of a way of making figures. And I find that quite scary, but very fascinating. And then on the other side of that, we were talking earlier about the fact that the division between men and women and how they look has very much changed. If, say, 100 years ago, it was exact opposite, and the women were in their frou-frou dresses and their fancy hairdos and all the rest of it, and the men were in the suits. So they were completely set apart by their clothes. Now it's not a fact at all, and even people are buying things in the same stores. I remember the last time I was in South Korea, and I saw that everybody was, when I say everybody, I mean a lot of young people mainly, were buying the same, they're trying on the same things in the stores. So a lot of things have already changed. So will we get as far as what you've just suggested? To be truthful, I don't know. And I'm not sure that you know either.
I certainly do not know. Well, thank you very much, Suzy, for this particular conversation. I totally enjoyed it.
It's so wonderful when somebody asks such intelligent questions. It's so easy. The time goes by so fast.
Oh, well, no, don't. I'm not an interviewer, so I was already a little bit nervous. I thought, oh, here I am with the ultimate interviewer doing an interview. That's quite tough, I thought. Okay, thank you very much for being so kind to me and kind to us as to our audience.
Well, thank you so much for including me in what you're doing. I love your country, and I think that it's terrific that you always seem to be ahead of the curve in terms of everything you do. So congratulations.